The storm had taken them. Wind like scream, rain cutting the desert in wild ribbons. And when it passed, her sons were gone. The widow stood beneath a sky torn open by lightning, calling their names until her throat bled against the wind. But the canyon swallowed her voice whole. Only silence answered back, that vast, merciless silence of the frontier that cared for no mother's heart. 3 days had passed since then. The fire had gone cold. Her parrot-green dress hung heavy with dust, and her hands trembled as she traced small footprints that vanished into the ravine. The land gave no clue, no mercy. Her body ached from walking, her lips cracked from thirst, yet she moved still, guided by something deeper than reason, the instinct of a mother who refused to accept the grave's whisper. By dusk, she knelt at the edge of the desert plain, eyes hollow, prayers breaking on her lips. The townsfolk had stopped searching at sunrise. The desert doesn't return what it takes, they said. She knew that truth. She had buried a husband under that same sand. But children were different. They carried her breath within them. If the earth had swallowed them, it would have to swallow her too. Then a sound. Faint. The rhythmic thud of hooves against dry ground. At first she thought it a trick of grief, a heartbeat echoing in her mind. But the sound grew, slow, steady, nearing. She rose, spine stiff with terror and hope, and saw a figure breaking through the horizon's heat. A rider. Dust coiled around the horse's legs like smoke. The sun flared behind him, outlining a tall form in a weathered hat, a leather vest clinging to a frame shaped by years of wind and labor. She did not move, could not. The horse slowed, and then she saw them. 3 small shapes slumped before him, wrapped in his coat. Her breath caught. The world tilted. Her knees buckled beneath her. The rider dismounted, silent as dusk itself. He lifted each child down carefully, his rough hands trembling as if handling fragile glass. They were pale, lips dry, but alive. The oldest stirred first, eyelids fluttering, a whisper breaking through cracked lips. "Mama." The sound was more than a word. It was a resurrection. She gathered them to her chest, fingers clutching them as if afraid they might dissolve into dust. Her tears fell onto their faces, darkening the dirt, mixing grief and relief into one trembling flood. The stranger stepped back, his eyes lowering, had held against his chest. He said nothing. There was reverence in his silence, as though witnessing something holy. When at last she looked up at him, her vision blurred, and for a heartbeat she thought the light behind him was part of his being, gold bleeding through shadow. Later, when the boys slept near a rekindled fire, she learned his name was Eli. He had found their tracks near the dry creek, followed them through the canyon where wolves howled like ghosts. He'd given them his coat, shared his water, carried the youngest in his arms when their legs failed. "Why?" she asked, her voice thin, frayed with disbelief. Eli looked into the fire instead of her. "Because someone once searched for mine," he said quietly. No one came. The flames flickered, painting his face in amber and ash. There was a scar running along his jaw, the kind that carried memory rather than danger. He spoke like a man who had already met loss and made peace with its company. Night deepened around them. The desert exhaled. The boys slept close to her legs, and Eli sat a few feet away, hat drawn low, eyes fixed on the stars as if seeking permission to stay. Between them, the silence grew soft, no longer an empty thing, but a bridge. She watched him for a long while. In his stillness, she saw not a savior, but a man bound by the same quiet loneliness that had haunted her. It stirred something fragile inside her chest, something she didn't yet dare to name. When dawn began to stir the sky with pale light, Eli rose to check the horses. She watched his movements, deliberate, gentle, careful not to wake the sleeping boys. The desert wind tugged at his shirt, carrying the faint scent of rain long gone. He turned slightly, met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw it, the grief behind his steadiness, the shadow of his own lost family flickering beneath the calm. It struck her like truth spoken in another tongue. As the sun climbed higher, the boys stirred, whispering and laughing weakly. Life was returning. But the widow's heart was caught in a new storm, quiet, unseen, trembling between gratitude and something deeper. She watched Eli mount his horse, a solitary figure framed by light. He hesitated, glanced back once, and the look he gave her held a weight she could not yet measure. It wasn't farewell. It was a beginning pretending to be one. The drought came quietly, stealing color from the land like a thief at dusk. By midsummer, the riverbed had cracked into a map of scars, and the air shimmered with the sound of thirst. The widow's small camp stood against it all, a tent, a fence half-mended, and 4 hearts learning the fragile shape of safety. But even safety, she knew, was a thing that could vanish overnight. Eli had stayed, said he'd leave after the horses healed, but the days folded into one another until his promise turned to dust. He fixed what was broken, hauled water, taught the boys how to read a sky for rain. They adored him, clung to his every word, followed his steady footsteps like they were tracing the path of certainty itself. And she watched quietly from behind the rhythm of her chores, wondering what kind of man stayed after his debt was paid. The heat made tempers sharp. Town folk came riding one day, bringing whispers that a man named Eli Ward had once worked for a rancher who'd vanished, leaving blood in the dirt and no body to bury. They said Eli rode off that same night. The widow felt the words like barbed wire coiling inside her chest. She didn't ask him about it, not that night, but her silence trembled between them, heavy as thunder. He knew. After supper, when the boys slept, Eli sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, the rasping sound slow and steady. She stood nearby, arms crossed, trying to anchor her voice. "They're saying you killed a man," she whispered. He didn't look up. "They've been saying that for years." "Is it true?" The knife paused mid-stroke. He lifted his gaze, and for a heartbeat she saw it, a wound far older than any sin. "I buried the man I was that night," he said. "Does that count?" Her breath caught. Truth is a strange thing. It doesn't always heal, but it makes running impossible. She turned away, heart pounding, torn between fear and the quiet knowing that this man had carried more sorrow than menace. The next day, she worked harder than she needed to, chopping wood, fetching water, anything to keep from thinking. But the desert has a way of forcing stillness, and by dusk she found herself standing near the corral, watching Eli tend to a wounded mare. His hands were gentle, voice low, eyes steady. The creature calmed under his touch, and something in her heart broke open with it. She spoke before she could stop herself. "You could have gone. You still can." Eli tied the bandage tight, wiped his brow, and finally looked at her. "You think staying here is easy?" Her throat burned. "Then why do it?" He stepped closer, the air between them tightening. "Because I know what it is to lose everything. And I can't watch you lose more." The words landed like a confession, not of love, but of belonging. He turned away before she could answer, as though the truth itself were too much to hold. That night, a storm rolled in from the west, not rain, but wind, wild and dry, carrying the scent of lightning. The tent shuddered. The boys cried out. Eli was at the flap before the wind could tear it loose, securing ropes, shouting instructions. She joined him, clutching the youngest to her chest. Dust whipped through the air, slicing against their skin. In the chaos, her hand found his, and neither let go. When the storm passed, dawn came silver and cold. The camp was half buried in sand, the fence gone, the water barrels toppled. But they were alive. The boys slept exhausted, and she sat beside Eli outside the tent. The world smelled of wet dust and iron. He handed her a cup of water, his fingers brushing hers. "You should go into town tomorrow," he said softly. "Get supplies. The river's almost dry." She studied his face, the lines etched by sun and loss, the steadiness that never wavered. "You're leaving," she said, not asking. He didn't answer right away. The silence said enough. "You think the past makes you unworthy," she whispered. "But it's what makes you kind." His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the horizon. Kindness doesn't wash away ghosts. She reached for his hand, then stopped, caught in the space between courage and restraint. "Eli," he stood before she could finish. "If I stay, the storm won't be outside the tent next time. It'll be me." She rose too, defiance trembling in her voice. "Then let it come." He looked at her one last time, and in that look was everything: gratitude, ache, the weight of what could have been. Then he walked into the pale morning light, dust curling around his boots, the horizon swallowing him whole. The widow stood there long after he vanished, heart heavy, but alive with a strange new rhythm, the sound of hope learning to breathe again.